Section 6. One single monarch held out against the general acquiescence in the new rule, and that was the strange survival of medievalism, the Slavic fox, the king of the Balkans. He debated and delayed his submissions. He showed an extraordinary combination of cunning and temerity in his evasion of the repeated summonses from Brissago. He affected ill health and a great preoccupation with his new official mistress, for his semi-barbaric court was arranged on the best romantic models. His tactics were ably seconded by Dr. Pestovich, his chief minister. Failing to establish his claims to complete independence, King Ferdinand Charles annoyed the conference by a proposal to be treated as a protected state. Finally, he professed an unconvincing submission, and put a mass of obstacles in the way of the transfer of his national officials to the new government. In these things he was enthusiastically supported by his subjects, still for the most part an illiterate peasantry, passionately if confusedly patriotic, and so far with no practical knowledge of the effect of atomic bombs. More particularly, he retained control of all the Balkan aeroplanes. For once, the extreme naivete of Leblanc seems to have been mitigated by duplicity. He went on with the general pacification of the world as if the Balkan submission was made in absolute good faith, but he announced the disbandment of the force of aeroplanes that hitherto guarded the council at Brissago upon the approaching 15th of July, but instead he doubled the number upon duty on that eventful day, and made various arrangements for their disposition. He consulted certain experts, and when he took King Egbert into his confidence, there was something in his neat and explicit foresight that brought back to that ex-monarch's mind his half-forgotten fantasy of Leblanc as a fisherman under a green umbrella. About 5 o'clock in the morning of the 17th of July, one of the elder sentinels of the Brissago fleet, which was soaring unobtrusively over the lower end of the Lake of Garda, sighted and hailed a strange aeroplane that was flying westward, and, failing to get a satisfactory reply, set its wireless apparatus talking and gave chase. A swarm of consorts appeared very promptly over the westward mountains, and before the unknown aeroplane had sighted Como, it had a dozen eager attendants closing upon it. Its driver seems to have hesitated, dropped down among the mountains, and then turned southward in flight, only to find an intercepting biplane sweeping across his bows. Then he went round into the eye of the rising sun, and passed within 100 yards of his original pursuer. The sharpshooter therein opened fire at once, and showed an intelligent grasp of the situation by disabling the passenger first. The man at the wheel must have heard his companion cry out behind him, but he was too intent on getting away to waste even a glance behind. Twice after that he must have heard shots. He let his engine go, he crouched down, and for 20 minutes he must have steered in the continual expectation of a bullet. It never came, and when at last he glanced around, 3 planes were close upon him, and his companion, thrice hit, lay dead across the bombs. His followers manifestly did not mean either to upset or shoot him, but inexorably they drove him down, down. At last he was curving and flying 100 yards or less over the level fields of rice and maize. Ahead of him, and dark against the morning sunrise, was a village with a very tall and slender campanile and a line of cable bearing metal standards that he could not clear. He stopped his engine abruptly and dropped flat. He may have hoped to get at the bombs when he came down, but his pitiless pursuers drove right over him and shot him as he fell. 3 other aeroplanes curved down and came to rest amidst the grass close by the smashed machine. Their passengers descended and ran, holding their light rifles in their hands, towards the debris and the 2 dead men. The coffin-shaped box that had occupied the center of the machine had broken, and 3 black objects, each with 2 handles like the ears of a pitcher, lay peacefully amidst the litter. These objects were so tremendously important in the eyes of their captors, that they disregarded the 2 dead men who lay bloody and broken amidst the wreckage, as they might have disregarded dead frogs by a country pathway. "By God!" cried the first. "Here they are, and unbroken," said the second. "I've never seen the things before," said the first. "Bigger than I thought," said the second. The third comer arrived. He stared for a moment at the bombs, and then turned his eyes to the dead man with a crushed chest, who lay in a muddy place among the green stems under the center of the machine. "One can take no risks," he said, with a faint suggestion of apology. The other 2 now also turned to the victims. "We must signal," said the first man. A shadow passed between them and the sun, and they looked up to see the aeroplane that had fired the last shot. "Shall we signal?" came a megaphone hail. "3 bombs," they answered together. "Where do they come from?" asked the megaphone. The 3 sharpshooters looked at each other, and then moved towards the dead men. One of them had an idea. "Signal that first," he said, "while we look." They were joined by their aviators for the search, and all 6 men began a hunt that was necessarily brutal in its haste, for some indication of identity. They examined the men's pockets, their blood-stained clothes, the machine, the framework. They turned the bodies over and flung them aside. There was not a tattoo mark. Everything was elaborately free of any indication of its origin. "We can't find out," they called at last. "Not a sign?" "Not a sign." "I'm coming down," said the man overhead. Section 7. The Slavic fox stood upon a metal balcony in his picturesque Art Nouveau palace that gave upon the precipice that overhung his bright little capital, and beside him stood Pestovitch, grizzled and cunning, and now full of an ill-suppressed excitement. Behind them the window opened into a large room, richly decorated in aluminum and crimson and enamel, across which the king, as he glanced ever and again over his shoulder with a gesture of inquiry, could see through the 2 open doors of a little azure-walled antechamber, the wireless operator in the turret working at his incessant transcription. 2 pompously uniformed messengers waited listlessly in this apartment. The room was furnished with a stately dignity, and had in the middle of it a big green baize covered table, with the massive white metal ink pots, and antiquated sandboxes natural to a new but romantic monarchy. It was the king's council chamber, and about it now, in attitudes of suspended intrigue, stood the half-dozen ministers who constituted his cabinet. They had been summoned for 12 o'clock, but still at half-past 12 the king loitered in the balcony, and seemed to be waiting for some news that did not come. The king and his minister had talked at first in whispers. They had fallen silent, for they found little now to express except a vague anxiety. Away there on the mountainside there were the white metal roofs of the long farm buildings beneath which the bomb factory and the bombs were hidden. The chemist who had made all of these for the king had died suddenly after the declaration of Brissago. Nobody knew of that store of mischief now but the king and his adviser, and 3 heavily faithful attendants. The aviators who waited now, in the midday blaze with their bomb-carrying machines, and their passenger bomb throwers in the exercising grounds of the motorcyclist barracks below were still in ignorance of the position of the ammunition they were presently to take up. It was time they started if the scheme was to work as Pestovitch had planned it. It was a magnificent plan. It aimed at no less than the empire of the world. The government of idealists and professors away there at Brissago was to be blown to fragments, and then east, west, north, and south those airplanes would go swarming over a world that had disarmed itself, to proclaim Ferdinand Charles, the new Caesar, the master, lord of the earth. It was a magnificent plan. But the tension of this waiting for news of the success of the first blow was considerable. The Slavic fox was full of pallid fairness. He had a remarkably long nose, a thick, short mustache, and small blue eyes that were a little too near together to be pleasant. It was his habit to worry his mustache with short, nervous tugs whenever his restless mind troubled him, and now this motion was becoming so incessant that it irked Pestovitch beyond the limits of endurance. "I will go," said the minister, "and see what the trouble is with the wireless. They will give us nothing, good or bad." Left to himself, the king could worry his mustache without stint. He leant his elbows forward on the balcony, and gave both of his long white hands to the work, so that he looked like a pale dog gnawing a bone. Suppose they caught his men, what should he do? Suppose they caught his men. The clocks on the light gold-capped belfries of the town below presently intimated the half-hour after midday. Of course, he and Pestovitch had thought it out. Even if they had caught those men, they were pledged to secrecy. Probably they would be killed in the catching. One could deny anyhow, deny and deny. And then he became aware of half a dozen little shining specks very high in the blue. Pestovitch came out to him presently. "The government messages, sire, have all dropped into cipher," he said. "I have sent a man—" "Look," interrupted the king, and pointed upward with a long lean finger. Pestovitch followed that indication, and then glanced for one questioning moment at the white face before him. "We have to face it out, sire." For some moments they watched the steep spirals of descending messengers, and then they began a hasty consultation. They decided that to be holding a council upon the details of an ultimate surrender to Brissago was an innocent looking thing as the king could well be doing. And so, when at last the ex-king Egbert, whom the council had sent as its envoy, arrived upon the scene, he discovered the king almost theatrically posed at the head of his councillors in the midst of his court. The door upon the wireless operators was shut. The ex-king from Brissago came like a draught through the curtains, an attendance that gave a wide margin to King Ferdinand's state, and the familiar confidence of his manner belied a certain hardness in his eye. Firmin trotted behind him, and no one else was with him. And as Ferdinand Charles rose to greet him, there came into the heart of the Balkan king, again, that same chilly feeling that he had felt upon the balcony, and it passed at the careless gestures of his guest. For surely any one might outwit this foolish talker who, for a mere idea at the command of a little French rationalist in spectacles, had thrown away the most ancient crown in all the world. One must deny. And then slowly and quite tiresomely he realized that there was nothing to deny. His visitor, with an amiable ease, went on talking about everything in debate between himself and Brissago, except— Could it be that they had been delayed? Could it be that they had to drop for repairs and were still uncaptured? Could it be that even now, while this fool babbled, while they were over there among the mountains heaving their deadly charge over the side of the aeroplane, strange hopes began to lift the tail of the Slavic fox again? What was the man saying? One must talk to him anyhow until one knew. At any moment the little brass door behind him might open with the news of Brissago blown to atoms. Then it would be a delightful relief to the present tension to arrest this chatter forthwith. He might be killed perhaps. What? The king was repeating his observation. They have a ridiculous fantasy that your confidence is based on the possession of atomic bombs. King Ferdinand Charles pulled himself together. He protested. "Oh, quite so," said the ex-king. "Quite so." "What grounds?" The ex-king permitted himself a gesture and the ghost of a chuckle. Why the devil should he chuckle? "Practically none," he said. "But of course with these things one has to be so careful." And then again, for an instant, something, like the faintest shadow of derision, gleamed out of the envoy's eyes and recalled that chilly feeling to the King Ferdinand's spine. Some kindred depression had come to Pestovitch, who had been watching the drawn intensity of Firmin's face. He came to the help of his master, who, he feared, might protest too much. "A search!" cried the king. "An embargo on our airplanes." "Only a temporary expedient," said the ex-king Egbert, "while the search is going on." The king appealed to his council. "The people will never permit it, sire," said a bustling little man in a gorgeous uniform. "You'll have to make 'em," said the ex-king, genially addressing all the councilors. King Ferdinand glanced at the closed brass door, through which no news would come. "When would you want to have this search?" The ex-king was radiant. "We couldn't possibly do it until the day after tomorrow," he said. "Just the capital?" "Where else?" asked the ex-king, still more cheerfully. "For my own part," said the ex-king confidentially, "I think the whole business ridiculous. Who would be such a fool as to hide atomic bombs? Nobody. Certain hanging if he's caught. Certain. And almost certain blowing up if he isn't. But nowadays I have to take orders like the rest of the world, and here I am." The king thought he had never met such detestable geniality. He glanced at Pestovitch, who nodded almost imperceptibly. It was well, anyhow, to have a fool to deal with. They might have sent a diplomatist. "Of course," said the king, "I recognize the overpowering force, and a kind of logic, in these orders from Brissago." "I knew you would," said the ex-king, with an air of relief, "and so let us arrange." They arranged with a certain informality. No Balkan aeroplane was to adventure into the air until the search was concluded, and meanwhile the fleets of the world government would soar and circle in the sky. The towns were to be placarded with offers of reward to anyone who would help in the discovery of atomic bombs. "You will sign that," said the ex-king. "Why?" "To show that we aren't in any way hostile to you." Pestovitch nodded yes to his master. "And then, you see," said the ex-king in that easy way of his, "we'll have a lot of men here, borrow help from your police, and run through all your things. And then everything will be over. Meanwhile, if I may be your guest." When presently Pestovitch was alone with the king again, he found him in a state of jangling emotions. His spirit was tossing like a wind-whipped sea. One moment he was exalted and full of contempt for "that ass" and his search. The next he was down in a pit of dread. "They will find them, Pestovitch, and then he'll hang us." "Hang us?" The king put his long nose into his counselor's face. "That grinning brute wants to hang us," he said, "and hang us he will, if we give him a shadow of a chance." "But all their modern state civilization! Do you think there's any pity in that crew of godless, vivisecting prigs?" cried this last king of romance. "Do you think, Pestovitch, they understand anything of a high ambition or a splendid dream? Do you think that our gallant and sublime adventure has any appeal to them? Here am I, the last and greatest and most romantic of the Caesars, and do you think they will miss the chance of hanging me like a dog if they can, killing me like a rat in a hole? And that renegade, he who was once an anointed king. I hate that sort of eye that laughs and keeps hard," said the king. "I won't sit here and be caught like a fascinated rabbit," said the king in conclusion. "We must shift those bombs." "Risk it," said Pestovitch. "Leave them alone." "No," said the king. "Shift them near the frontier. Then while they watch us here, they will always watch us here now, we can buy an airplane abroad, and pick them up." The king was in a feverish, irritable mood all that evening, but he made his plans nevertheless with infinite cunning. They must get the bombs away. There must be a couple of atomic hay lorries. The bombs could be hidden under the hay. Pestovitch went and came, instructing trusty servants, planning and replanning. The king and the ex-king talked very pleasantly of a number of subjects. All while at the back of King Ferdinand Charles' mind fretted the mystery of his vanished airplane. There came no news of its capture, and no news of its success. At any moment all that power at the back of his visitor might crumble away and vanish. It was past midnight when the king, in a cloak and slouch hat that might equally have served a small farmer, or any respectable middle-class man, slipped out from an inconspicuous service gate on the eastward side of his palace into the thickly wooded gardens that sloped in a series of terraces down to the town. Pestovitch and his guard valet Peter, both wrapped about in a similar disguise, came out among the laurels that bordered the pathway and joined them. It was a clear, warm night, but the stars seemed unusually little and remote because of the airplanes, each trailing a searchlight, that drove hither and thither across the blue. One great beam seemed to rest on the king for a moment as he came out of the palace, then instantly and reassuringly it had swept away. But while they were still in the palace gardens, another found them and looked at them. "They see us!" cried the king. "They make nothing of us," said Pestovitch. The king glanced up and met a calm, round eye of light that seemed to wink at him and vanish, leaving him blinded. The three men went on their way. Near the little gate in the garden railings that Pestovitch had caused to be unlocked, the king paused under the shadow of a flex and looked back at the place. It was very high and narrow, a 20th century rendering of medievalism in stone and bronze and sham stone and opaque glass. Against the sky it splashed a confusion of pinnacles. High up in the eastward wing were the windows of the apartments of the ex-King Egbert. One of them was brightly lit now, and against the light a little black figure stood very still and looked out upon the night. The king snarled. "He little knows how we slipped through his fingers," said Pestovitch. And as he spoke, they saw the ex-king stretch out his arms slowly, like one who yawns, knuckle his eyes, and turn inward, no doubt to his bed. Down through the ancient winding back streets of his capital hurried the king, and at an appointed corner A shabby atomic automobile waited for the three. It was a hackney carriage of the lowest grade, with dinted metal panels and deflated cushions. The driver was one of the ordinary drivers of the capital, but beside him sat the young secretary of Pestovitch, who knew the way to the farm where the bombs were hidden. The automobile made its way through the narrow streets of the old town, which were still lit and uneasy, for the fleet of airships overhead had kept the cafes open and people abroad, over the great new bridge, and so by straggling outskirts to the city. And all through his capital the king who hoped to outdo Caesar sat back and was very still, and no one spoke. And as they got out into the dark country, they became aware of the searchlights wandering over the countryside, like the uneasy ghosts of giants. The king sat forward and looked at these flittering whitenesses, and every now and then peered up to see the flying ships overhead. "I don't like them," said the king. Presently one of these patches of moonlight came to rest about them and seemed to be following their automobile. The king drew back. "The things are confoundedly noiseless," said the king. "It's like being stalked by lean white cats." He peered again. "That fellow is watching us," he said, and then suddenly he gave way to panic. "Pestovitch," he said, clutching his minister's arm, "they are watching us. I'm not going through with us. They are watching us. I'm going back." Pestovitch remonstrated. "Tell him to go back," said the king, and tried to open the window. For a few moments there was a grim struggle in the automobile, a gripping of wrists and a blow. "I can't go through with it," repeated the king. "I can't go through with it." "But they'll hang us," said Pestovitch. "Not if we were to give up now. Not if we were to surrender the bombs. It is you who brought me into this." At last Pestovitch compromised. There was an inn perhaps half a mile from the farm. They could alight there, and the king could get brandy, and rest his nerves for a time. And if he still thought fit to go back, he could go back. "See," said Pestovitch, "the light has gone on again." The king peered up. "I believe he's following us without a light," said the king. In the little old dirty inn, the king hung doubtful for a time, and was for going back and throwing himself on the mercy of the council. "If there is a council," said Pestovitch, "by this time your bombs may have settled it." "But if so, these infernal airplanes would go." "They may not know yet." "But, Pestovitch, why couldn't you do all this without me?" Pestovitch made no answer for a moment. "I was for leaving the bombs in their place," he said at last, and went to the window. About their conveyance shone a circle of bright light. Pestovitch had a brilliant idea. "I will send my secretary out to make a kind of dispute with the driver, something that will make them watch up above there. Meanwhile you and I and Peter will go out by the back way and up by the hedges to the farm." It was worthy of his subtle reputation, and it answered passing well. In 10 minutes they were tumbling over the wall of the farmyard, wet, muddy, and breathless, but unobserved. But as they ran toward the barns, the king gave vent to something between a groan and a curse, and all about them shone the light, and passed. But had it passed at once, or lingered for just a second? "They didn't see us," said Peter. "I don't think they saw us," said the king, and stared as the light went swooping up the mountainside, hung for a second about a hayrick, and then came pouring back. "In the barn!" cried the king. He bruised his shin against something, and then all 3 men were inside the huge steel-girdered barn, in which stood the 2 motor hay lorries that were to take the bombs away. Kurt and Abel, the 2 brothers of Peter, had brought the lorries thither in daylight. They had the upper half of the loads of hay thrown off, ready to cover the bombs, so soon as the king should show the hiding place. "There's a sort of pit here," said the king. "Don't light another lantern. This key of mine releases a ring." For a time scarcely a word was spoken in the darkness of the barn. There was a sound of a slab being lifted, and then of feet descending a ladder into a pit, then whispering, and then heavy breathing as Kurt came struggling up with the first of the hidden bombs. "We shall do it yet," said the king, and then he gasped, "Curse that light! Why in the name of heaven didn't we shut the barn door?" For the great door stood wide open and all the empty, lifeless yard outside, and the door and 6 feet of the floor of the barn were in the blue glare of an inquiring searchlight. "Shut the door, Peter," said Pestovitch. "No," cried the king, too late, as Peter went forward into the light. "Don't show yourself!" cried the king. Kurt made a step forward and plucked his brother back. For a time all 5 men stood still. It seemed that light would never go, and then abruptly it was turned off, leaving them blinded. "Now," said the king uneasily, "now shut the door." "Not completely," cried Pestovitch. "Leave a chink for us to go out by." It was hot work shifting those bombs, and the king worked for a time like a common man. Kurt and Abel carried the great things up, and Peter brought them to the carts, and the king and Pestovitch helped him to place them among the hay. They made as little noise as they could. "Shh!" cried the king. "What's that?" But Kurt and Abel did not hear, and came blundering up the ladder with the last of the load. "Shh!" Peter ran forward to them with a whispered remonstrance. Now they were still. The barn door opened a little wider, and against the dim blue light outside they saw the black shape of a man. "Any one here?" he asked, speaking with an Italian accent. The king broke into a cold perspiration. Then Pestovitch answered. "Only a poor farmer loading hay," he said, and picked up a huge hay fork and went forward softly. "You load your hay at a very bad time and in a very bad light," said the man at the door, peering in. "Have you no electric light here?" Then suddenly he turned on an electric torch, and as he did so Pestovitch sprang forward. "Get out of my barn!" he cried, and drove the fork full at the intruder's chest. He had a vague idea that he might stab the man to silence. But the man shouted loudly as the prongs pierced him and drove him backward, and instantly there was a sound of feet running across the yard. "Bombs!" cried the man upon the ground, struggling with the prongs in his hand, and as Pestovitch staggered forward into view with the force of his own thrust, he was shot through the body by one of the 2 newcomers. The man on the ground was hurt badly, but plucky. "Bombs!" he repeated, and struggled up to a kneeling position, and held his electric torch full upon the face of the king. "Shoot them!" he cried, coughing and spitting blood, so that the halo of light round the king's head danced about. For a moment in that shivering circle of light, the 2 men saw the king kneeling up in the cart, and Peter on the barn floor beside him. The old fox looked at them sideways, snared, a white-faced evil thing, and then, with a faltering suicidal heroism, he leant forward over the bomb before him. They fired together and shot him through the head. The upper part of his face seemed to vanish. "Shoot them!" cried the man who had been stabbed. "Shoot them all!" And then his light went out, and he rolled over with a groan at the feet of his comrades. But each carried a light of his own, and in another moment everything in the barn was visible again. They shot Peter even as he held up his hands in sign of surrender. Kurt and Abel at the head of the ladder hesitated for a moment, and then plunged backwards into the pit. "If we don't kill them," said one of the sharpshooters. "They'll blow us to rags. They've gone down that hatchway. Come!" "Here they are. Hands up, I say. Hold your light while I shoot." Section 8. It was still quite dark, when his valet and Firmin came together and told the ex-King Egbert that the business was settled. He started up into a sitting position on the side of his bed. "Did he go out?" asked the ex-king. "He is dead," said Firmin. "He was shot." The ex-king reflected. "That's about the best thing that could have happened," he said. "Where are the bombs? In that farmhouse on the opposite hillside? Why, the place is in sight. Let us go. I'll dress. Is there any one in that place, Firmin, to get us a cup of coffee?" Through the hungry twilight of the dawn, the ex-king's automobile carried him to the farmhouse where the last rebel king was lying among his bombs. The rim of the sky flashed, the east grew bright, and the sun was just rising over the hills, when King Egbert reached the farmyard. There he found the hay lorries drawn out from the barn, with the dreadful bombs still packed upon them. A couple of score of aviators held the yard, and outside a few peasants stood in a little group and stared, ignorant as yet of what had happened. Against the stone wall of the farmyard 5 bodies were lying neatly side to side, and Pestovitch had an expression of surprise on his face, and the king was chiefly identifiable by his long white hands and his blond mustache. The wounded aeronaut had been carried down to the inn, and after the ex-king had given directions in what manner the bombs were to be taken to the new special laboratories above Zurich, where they could be unpacked in an atmosphere of chlorine, he turned to those 5 still shapes. Their 5 pairs of feet stuck out with a curious stiff unanimity. "What else was there to do?" he said in answer to some internal protest. "I wonder, Firmin, if there are any more of them?" "Bombs, sir?" asked Firmin. "No, such kings." "The pitiful folly of it," said the ex-king, following his thoughts. "Firmin, as an ex-professor of international politics, I think it falls to you to bury them. There? No, don't put them near the well. People will have to drink from that well. Bury them over there, some way off in the field." End of chapter 3. Chapter the 4th. The New Phase. Section 1. The task that lay before the assembly of Brissago, viewed as we may view it now from the clarifying standpoint of things accomplished, was in its broad issues a simple one. Essentially, it was to place social organization upon the new footing that the swift, accelerated advance of human knowledge had rendered necessary. The council was gathered together with the haste of a salvage expedition, and it was confronted with wreckage, but the wreckage was irreparable wreckage, and the only possibilities of the case were either the relapse of mankind to the agricultural barbarism from which it had emerged so painfully, or the acceptance of achieved science as the basis of a new social order. The old tendencies of human nature, suspicion, jealousy, particularism, and belligerency, were incompatible with the monstrous destructive power of the new appliances of the inhuman logic of science had produced. The equilibrium could be restored only by civilization destroying itself down to a level at which modern apparatus could no longer be produced, or by human nature adapting itself in its institutions to the new conditions. It was for the latter alternative that the assembly existed. Sooner or later, this choice would have confronted mankind. The sudden development of atomic science did but precipitate and render rapid a dramatic clash between the new and the customary, that had been gathering since ever the first flint was chipped or the first fire built together. From the day when man contrived himself a tool and suffered another male to draw near him, he ceased to be altogether a thing of instinct and untroubled convictions. From that day forth, a widening breach can be traced between his egotistical passions and the social need. Slowly he adapted himself to the life of the homestead, and his passionate impulses widened out to the demands of the clan and the tribe. But widen though his impulses might, the latent hunter and wanderer in his imagination outstripped their development. He was never quite subdued to the soil, nor quite tamed to the home. Everywhere it needed teaching and the priest to keep him within the bounds of the plough life and the beast tending. Slowly a vast system of traditional imperatives superposed itself upon his instincts, imperatives that were admirably fitted to make him that cultivator, that cattle mincer, who was for twice 10,000 years the normal man. And, unpremeditated, undesired, out of the accumulations of his tilling came civilization. Civilization was the agricultural surplus. It appeared as trade and tracks and roads. It pushed boats out upon the rivers, and presently invaded the seas. And within its primitive courts, within temples grown rich and leisurely amidst the gathering medley of the seaport towns, rose speculation and philosophy and science, and the beginning of the new order that has at last established itself as human life. Slowly at first, as we traced it, and then with an accumulating velocity, the new powers were fabricated. Man as a whole did not seek them nor desire them. They were thrust into his hand. For a time, men took up and used these new things, and the new powers inadvertently as they came to him, recking nothing of the consequences. For endless generations, change led him very gently, but when he had been led far enough, change quickened the pace. It was with a series of shocks that he realized at last that he was living the old life less and less, and a new life more and more. Already before the release of atomic energy, the tensions between the old way of living and the new were intense. They were far intenser than they had been even at the collapse of the Roman imperial system. On the one hand was the ancient life of the family and the small community and the petty industry, and on the other was a new life on a larger scale, with remoter horizons and a strange sense of purpose. Already it was growing clear that men must live on one side or the other. One could not have had little tradespeople and syndicated businesses in the same market, sleeping carters and motor trolleys on the same road, bows and arrows and airplane sharpshooters in the same army, or illiterate peasant industries and power-driven factories in the same world. And still less it was possible that one could have the ideas and ambitions and greed and jealousy of peasants equipped with the vast appliances of the new age. If there had been no atomic bombs to bring together most of the directing intelligence of the world to that hasty conference at Brissago, there would have still been, extended over great areas and a considerable space of time perhaps, a less formal conference of responsible and understanding people upon the perplexities of this worldwide opposition. If the work of Holston had been spread over centuries, and imparted to the world by imperceptible degrees, it would nevertheless have made it necessary for men to take counsel upon and set a plan for the future. Indeed, already there had been accumulating for 100 years before the crisis a literature of foresight. There was a whole mass of modern state scheming available for the conference to go upon. These bombs did but accentuate and dramatize an already developing problem. Section 2. This assembly was no leap of exceptional minds and superintelligence into the control of affairs. It was teachable. Its members trailed ideas with them to the gathering, but these were the consequences of the moral shock the bombs had given humanity, and there is no reason for supposing its individual personalities were greatly above the average. It would be possible to cite 1,000 instances of error and inefficiency in its proceedings due to the forgetfulness, irritability, or fatigue of its members. It experimented considerably and blundered often. Excepting Holston, whose gift was highly specialized, it is questionable whether there was a single man of the first order of human quality in the gathering. But it had a modest fear of itself, and a consequent directness that gave it a general distinction. There was, of course, a noble simplicity about Leblanc, but even of him it may be asked whether he was not rather good and honest-minded than in the fuller sense great. The ex-king had wisdom and a certain romantic dash. He was a man among thousands, even if he was not a man among millions. But his memoirs, and indeed his decision to write memoirs, gave the quality of himself and his associates. The book makes admirable but astonishing reading. Therein he takes the great work the council was doing for granted as a little child takes God. It is as if he had no sense of it at all. He tells amusing trivialities about his cousin Wilhelm and his secretary Firmin. He pokes fun at the American president, who was, indeed, rather a little accident of the political machine than a representative American. And he gives a long description of how he was lost for 3 days in the mountains, in the company of the only Japanese member, a loss that seems to have caused no serious interruption of the work of the council. The Brissago conference has been written about time after time, as though it were a gathering of the very flower of humanity. Perched up there by the freak or wisdom of Leblanc, it had a certain Olympian quality, and the natural tendency of the human mind to elaborate such a resemblance would have give us its members the likenesses of gods. It would be equally reasonable to compare it to one of those enforced meetings upon the mountain tops that must have occurred in the opening phases of the deluge. The strength of the council lay not in itself, but in the circumstances that had quickened its intelligence, dispelled its vanities, and emancipated it from traditional ambitions and antagonisms. It was stripped of the accumulation of centuries, a naked government with all that freedom of action that nakedness affords, and its problems were set before it with a plainness that was out of all comparison with the complicated and perplexing intimations of the former time. Section 3. The world on which the council looked did indeed present a task quite sufficiently immense and altogether too urgent for any wanton indulgence in internal dissension. It may be interesting to sketch in a few phrases the condition of mankind at the close of the period of warring states. In the year of crisis that followed the release of atomic power, it was a world extraordinarily limited when one measures it by later standards, and it was now in a state of the direst confusion and distress. It must be remembered that at this time men had still to spread into enormous areas of the land surface of the globe. There were vast mountain wildernesses, forest wildernesses, sandy deserts, and foreign lands. Men still clung closely to water and arable soil in temperate or subtropic climates. They lived abundantly only in river valleys, and all their great cities had grown upon large navigable rivers or close to ports upon the sea. Over great areas, even of this suitable land, flies and mosquitoes, armed with infection, had so far defeated human invasion, and under their protection the virgin forests, remained untouched. Indeed, the whole world, even in its most crowded districts, was filthy with flies and swarming with needless insect life, to an extent which is now almost incredible. A population map of the world in 1950 would have followed seashore and river courses so closely in its darker shading as to give an impression that Homo sapiens was an amphibious animal. His roads and railways lay also along the lower contours, only here and there to pierce some mountain barrier or reach some holiday resort did they clamber above 3,000 feet. And across the ocean his traffic passed in definite lines. There were hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean no ship ever traversed except by mischance. Into the mysteries of the solid globe under his feet he had not yet pierced for 5 miles, and it was still not 40 years since, with a tragic pertinacity, he had climbed to the poles of the earth. The limitless mineral wealth of the Arctic and Antarctic circles was still buried beneath vast accumulations of immemorial ice, and the secret riches of the inner zones of the crust were untapped and indeed unsuspected. The higher mountain regions were known only to a sprinkling of guide-led climbers, and the frequenters of a few gaunt hotels, and the vast rainless belts of land that lay across continental masses, from Gobi to Sahara, and along the backbone of America, with their perfect air, their daily baths of blazing sunshine, their nights of cool serenity and glowing stars, and their reservoirs of deep-lying water, were as yet only desolations of fear and death to the common imagination. And now under the shock of the atomic bombs, the great masses of population which had gathered into the enormous dingy town centers of that period were dispossessed and scattered disastrously over the surrounding rural areas. It was as if some brutal force, grown impatient at last at man's blindness, had with the deliberate intention of a rearrangement of population upon more wholesome lines, shaken the world. The great industrial regions and the large cities that had escaped the bombs were, because of their complete economic collapse, in almost as tragic a plight as those that blazed, and the countryside was disordered by a multitude of wandering and lawless strangers. In some parts of the world famine raged. In many regions there was plague. The plains of North India, which had become more and more dependent for the general welfare on the railways and that great system of irrigation canals which the malignant section of the patriots had destroyed, were in a state of peculiar distress. Whole villages lay dead together, no man heeding, and the very tigers and panthers that preyed upon the emaciated survivors crawled back infected into the jungle to perish. Large areas of China were a prey to brigand bands. It is a remarkable thing that no complete contemporary account of the explosion of the atomic bombs survives. There are, of course, innumerable allusions and partial records, and it is from these that subsequent ages must pierce together the image of these devastations. The phenomena, it must be remembered, changed greatly from day to day, and even from hour to hour, as the exploding bomb shifted its position, threw off fragments or came into contact with water or a fresh texture of soil. Barnet, who came within 40 miles of Paris early in October, is concerned chiefly with his account of the social confusion of the countryside and the problems of his command, but he speaks of heaped cloud masses of steam all along the sky to the southwest, and of a red glare beneath these at night. Parts of Paris were still burning, and numbers of people were camped in the fields even at this distance, watching over treasured heaps of salvaged loot. He speaks, too, of the distant rumbling of the explosion, like trains going over iron bridges. The other descriptions agree with this. They all speak of the continuous reverberations, or of the thuddering and hammering, or some such phrase, and they all testify to a huge pall of steam, from which rain would fall suddenly in torrents, and amidst which lightning played. Dawning nearer to Paris, an observer would have found the salvage camps increasing in number and blocking up the villages, and large numbers of people, often starving and ailing, camping under improvised tents because there was no place for them to go. The sky became more and more densely overcast, until at last it blotted out the light of day, and left nothing but a dull red glare, extraordinarily depressing to the spirit. In this dull glare, great numbers of people were still living, clinging to their houses, and in many cases subsisting in a state of partial famine upon the produce in their gardens, and the stores in the shops of the provision dealers. Coming in still closer, the investigator would have reached the police cordon, which was trying to check the desperate enterprise of those who would return to their homes, or rescue their more valuable possessions within the zone of imminent danger. That zone was rather arbitrarily defined. If our spectator could have gotten permission to enter it, he would have entered also a zone of uproar, a zone of perpetual thunderings, lit by a strange purplish red light, and quivering and swaying with the incessant explosion of the radioactive substance. Whole blocks of buildings were alight and burning fiercely, the trembling, ragged flames looking pale and ghastly, and attenuated in comparison with the full-bodied crimson glare beyond. The shells of other edifices already burnt rose, pierced by rows of window sockets against the red-lit mist. Every step farther would have been as dangerous as a descent within the crater of an active volcano. These spinning, boiling bomb centers would shift or break unexpectedly into new regions, new fragments of earth or drain or masonry, sudden caught by a jet of disruptive force, might come flying by the explorer's head, or the ground yawn a fiery grave beneath his feet. Few who had ventured into these areas of destruction and survived attempted any repetition of their experiences. There are stories of puffs of luminous, radioactive vapor drifting sometimes scores of miles from the bomb center and killing and scorching all they overtook. At first the conflagrations from the Paris center spread westward halfway to the sea. Moreover, the air in this infernal inner circle of red-lit ruins had a peculiar dryness and a blistering quality, so that it set up a soreness of the skin and lungs that was very difficult to heal. Such was the last state of Paris, and such on a larger scale was the condition of affairs in Chicago, and the same fate had overtaken Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo, the eastern half of London, Toulon, Kiel, and 218 other centers of population or armament. Each was a flaming center of radiant destruction that only time could quench, that indeed in many instances time has still to quench. To this day, though indeed with a constantly diminishing uproar and vigor, these explosions continue. In the map of nearly every country of the world, 3 or 4 or more red circles, a score of miles in diameter, mark the position of the dying atomic bombs and the death areas that men have been forced to abandon around them. Within these are perished museums, cathedrals, palaces, libraries, galleries of masterpieces, and a vast accumulation of human achievement, whose charred remains lie buried, a legacy of curious material that only future generations may hope to examine. Section 4. The state of mind of the dispossessed urban population which swarmed and perished so abundantly over the countryside during the dark days of the autumnal months that followed the last war, was one of blank despair. Barney gives sketch after sketch of groups of these people, cramped among the vineyards of Champagne, as he saw them during his period of service with the army of pacification. There was, for example, that man milliner who came out from a field beside the road that rises up eastward out of Epernay, and asked how things were going in Paris. He was, says Barney, a round-faced man, dressed very neatly in black, so neatly that it was amazing to discover he was living close at hand in a tent made of carpets, and he had an urbane but insistent manner, a carefully trimmed mustache and beard, expressive eyebrows, and hair very neatly brushed. "No one goes into Paris," said Barney. "But, monsieur, that is very unenterprising," the man by the wayside submitted. "The danger is too great. The radiations eat into people's skins." The eyebrows protested. "But is nothing to be done?" "Nothing can be done." "But, monsieur, it is extraordinarily inconvenient, this living in exile and waiting. My wife and little boy suffer extremely, there is a lack of amenity, and the season advances. I say nothing of the expense and difficulty in obtaining provisions. When does monsieur think that something will be done to render Paris possible?" Barney considered his interlocutor. "I'm told," said Barney, "that Paris is not likely to be possible again for several generations." "Oh, but this is preposterous! Consider, monsieur, what are people like ourselves to do in the meanwhile? I am a costumer. All my connections and interests, above all my style, demand Paris." Barney considered the sky, from which a light rain was beginning to fall, the wide fields about them from which the harvest had been taken, the trim poplars by the wayside. "Naturally," he agreed, "you want to go to Paris, but Paris is over." "Over!" "Finished." "But then, monsieur, what is to become of me?" Barney turned his face westward, whither the white road led. "Where else, for example, may I hope to find opportunity?" Barney made no reply. "Perhaps on the Riviera, or at some such place as Hamburg, or some plague perhaps." "All that," said Barney, accepting for the first time facts that had lain evident in his mind for weeks, "all that must be over too." There was a pause. Then the voice beside him broke out. "But, monsieur, it is impossible. It leaves nothing." "No, not very much." "One cannot suddenly begin to grow potatoes." "It would be good if monsieur could bring himself to the life of a peasant, and my wife, you do not know the distinguished delicacy of my wife, a refined helplessness, a peculiar dependent charm, like some slender tropical creeper, with great white flowers. But all this is foolish talk. It is impossible that Paris, which has survived so many misfortunes, should not presently revive." "I do not think it will ever revive. Paris is finished. London too, I am told. Berlin. All the great capitals were stricken." "But monsieur must permit me to differ." "It is so." "It is impossible. Civilizations do not end in this manner. Mankind will insist." "On Paris?" "On Paris." "Monsieur, you might as well hope to go down the Maelstrom, and resume business there." "I am content, monsieur, with my own fate." "The winter comes on. Would not monsieur be wiser to seek a house farther from Paris?" "No, monsieur. But it is not possible, monsieur, what you say, and you are under a tremendous mistake. Indeed you are in error. I ask merely for information. When I last saw him, said Barnet. He was standing under the signpost at the crest of the hill, gazing wistfully, yet it seemed to me a little doubtfully, now towards Paris, and altogether heedless of a drizzling rain that was wetting him through and through. Section 5. This effect of chill dismay, of a doom as yet imperfectly apprehended, deepens as Barnet's record passes on to tell of the approach of winter. It was too much for the great mass of those unwilling and incompetent nomads to realize that an age had ended, that the old help and guidance existed no longer, that times would not mend again, however patiently they held out. They were still in many cases looking to Paris, when the first snowflakes of that pitiless January came swirling about them. The story grows grimmer. If it is less monstrously tragic after Barnet's return to England, it is, if anything, harder. England was a spectacle of fear-embittered householders, hiding food, crushing out robbery, driving the starving wanderers from every faltering place upon the roads, lest they should die inconveniently and reproachfully on the doorsteps of those who had failed to urge them onward. The remnants of the British troops left France finally in March, after urgent representations from the provisional government at Orleans thought they could be supported no longer. They seem to have been a fairly well-behaved, but highly parasitic force throughout, though Barnet is clearly of opinion that they did much to suppress sporadic brigandage and maintain social order. He came home to a famine-stricken country, and his picture of the England of that spring is one of miserable patience and desperate expedients. The country was suffering much more than France, because of the cessation of the overseas supplies on which it had hitherto relied. His troops were given bread, dried fish, and boiled nettles at Dover, and marched inland to Ashford and paid off. On the way thither, they saw 4 men hanging from the telegraph posts by the roadside, who had been hung for stealing Swedes. The labor refuges of Kent, he discovered, were feeding their crowds of casual wanderers on bread into which clay and sawdust had been mixed. In Surrey there was a shortage of even such fare as that. He himself struck across country to Winchester, fearing to approach the bomb-poisoned district round London, and at Winchester he had the luck to be taken on as one of the wireless assistants at the central station and given regular rations. The station stood in a commanding position on the chalk hill that overlooks the town from the east. Thence he must have assisted in the transmission of the endless cipher messages that preceded the gathering at Brissago, and there was that the Brissago proclamation of the end of the war and the establishment of a world government came under his hands. He was feeling ill and apathetic that day, and he did not realize what it was he was transcribing. He did it mechanically, as a part of his tedious duty. Afterwards, there came a rush of messages arising out of the declaration that strained him very much, and in the evening when he was relieved, he ate his scanty supper and then went out upon the little balcony before the station, to smoke and rest his brains after this sudden and yet inexplicable press of duty. It was a very beautiful, still evening. He fell talking to a fellow operator, and for the first time, he declares, I began to understand what it was all about. I began to see just what enormous issues had been under my hands for the past 4 hours. But I became incredulous after my first stimulation. This is some sort of bunkum, I said very sagely. My colleague was more hopeful. It means an end to bomb throwing and destruction, he said. It means that presently corn will come from America. Who is going to send corn when there is no more value in money? I asked. Suddenly we were startled by a clashing from the town below. The cathedral bells, which had been silent ever since I had come into the district, were beginning, with a sort of rheumatic difficulty, to ring. Presently they warmed a little to the work, and we realized what was going on. They were ringing a peal. We listened with an unbelieving astonishment, and looking into each other's yellow faces. "They mean it," said my colleague. "But what can they do now?" I asked. "Everything is broken down." And on that sentence, with an unexpected artistry, Barnet abruptly ends his story. Section 6. From the first, the new government handled affairs with a certain greatness of spirit. Indeed, it was inevitable that they should act greatly. From the first they had to see the round globe as one problem. It was impossible any longer to deal with it piece by piece. They had to secure it universally from any fresh outbreak of atomic destruction, and they had to ensure a permanent and universal pacification. On this capacity to grasp and wield the whole round globe, their existence depended. There was no scope for any further performance. So soon as the seizure of the existing supplies of atomic ammunition and the apparatus for synthesizing Carolinum was assured, the disbanding or social utilization of the various masses of troops still under arms had to be arranged, the salvation of the year's harvests, and the feeding, housing, and employment of the drifting millions of homeless people. In Canada, in South America, and Asiatic Russia, there were vast accumulations of provision that was immovable only because of the breakdown of the monetary and credit systems. These had to be brought into the famine districts very speedily if entire depopulation was to be avoided, and their transportation and the revival of communications generally absorbed a certain proportion of the soldiery and more able unemployed. The task of housing assumed gigantic dimensions, and from building camps the housing committee of the council speedily passed to constructions of a more permanent type. They found far less friction than might have been expected in turning the loose population on their hands to these things. People were extraordinarily tamed by that year of suffering and death. They were disillusioned of their traditions, bereft of once obstinate prejudices. They felt foreign in a strange world, and ready to follow any confident leadership. The orders of the new government came with the best of all credentials, rations. The people everywhere were easy to control. One of the old labor experts who had survived until the new time witnesses, as gangs of emigrant workers in a new land. And now it was that the social possibilities of the atomic energy began to appear. The new machinery that had come into existence before the last wars increased and multiplied, and the council found itself not only with millions of hands at its disposal, but with power and apparatus that made its first conceptions of the work it had to do seem pitifully timid. The camps that were planned in iron and deal were built in stone and brass. The roads that were to have been mere iron tracks became spacious ways that insisted upon architecture. The cultivations of foodstuffs that were to have supplied emergency rations were presently, with synthesizers, fertilizers, actinic light, and scientific direction, in excess of every human need. The government had begun with the idea of temporarily reconstituting the social and economic system that had prevailed before the first coming of the atomic engine, because it was to this system that the ideas and habits of the great mass of the world's dispossessed population was adapted. Subsequent rearrangement it had hoped to leave to its successors, whoever they might be. But this, it became more and more manifest, was absolutely impossible. As well might the council have proposed a revival of slavery. The capitalist system had already been smashed beyond repair by the onset of limitless golden energy. It fell to pieces at the first endeavor to stand it up again. Already before the war, half of the industrial class had been out of work. The attempt to put them back into wages employment on the old lines was futile from the onset. The absolute shattering of the currency system alone would have been sufficient to prevent that, and it was necessary therefore to take over the housing, feeding, and clothing of this worldwide multitude without exacting any return in labor whatever. In a little while the mere absence of occupation for so great a multitude of people everywhere became an evident social danger, and the government was obliged to resort to such devices as simple decorative work in wood and stone, the manufacture of hand-woven textiles, fruit growing, flower growing, and landscape gardening on a grand scale to keep the less adaptable out of mischief, and of paying wages to the younger adults for attendance at school that would equip them to use the new atomic machinery. So quite insensibly the council drifted into a complete reorganization of urban and industrial life, and indeed of the entire social system. Ideas that are unhampered by political intrigue or financial considerations have a sweeping way with them, and before a year was out, the records of the council show clearly that it was rising to its enormous opportunity, and partly through its own direct control, and partly through a series of specific committees. It was planning a new common social order for the entire population of the earth. There can be no real social stability or any general human happiness while large areas of the world and large classes of people are in a phase of civilization different from the prevailing mass. It is impossible now to have great blocks of population misunderstanding the generally accepted social purpose, or at an economic disadvantage to the rest. So the council expressed its conception of the problem it had to solve. The peasant, the field worker, and all barbaric cultivators were at an economic disadvantage to the more mobile and educated classes, and the logic of the situation compelled the council to take up systematically the supersession of this stratum by a more efficient organization of production. It developed a scheme for the progressive establishment throughout the world of the modern system in agriculture, a system that should give the full advantages of a civilized life to every agricultural worker. And this replacement has been going on right up to the present day. The central idea of the modern system is a substitution of cultivating guilds for the individual cultivator, and for cottage and village life altogether. These guilds are associations of men and women who take over areas of arable or pasture land, and make themselves responsible for a certain average produce. They are bodies small enough as a rule to be run on a strictly democratic basis, and large enough to supply all the labor, except for a certain assistance from townspeople during the harvest, needed upon the land farmed. They have watchers' bungalows or chalets on the ground cultivated, but the ease and costlessness of modern locomotion enables them to maintain a group of residences in the nearest town, with a common dining room and clubhouse, and usually also a guild house in the national or provincial capital. Already this system has abolished a distinctively rustic population throughout vast areas of the Old World, where it has prevailed immemorially. That shy, unstimulated life of the lonely hovel, the narrow scandals and petty spies and persecutions of the small village, that hoarding, half inanimate existence away from books, thought, or social participation, and in constant contact with cattle, pigs, poultry, and their excrement, is passing away out of human experience. In a little while it will be gone altogether. In the 19th century it had already ceased to be a necessary human state, and only the absence of any collective intelligence, and an imagined need for tough and unintelligent soldiers and for a prolific class at a low level, prevented its systematic replacement at that time. And while this settlement of the country was in progress, the urban camps of the first phase of the Council's activities were rapidly developing, partly through the inherent forces of the situation, and partly through the Council's direction, into a modern type of town. Section 7. It is characteristic of the manner in which large enterprises forced themselves upon the Brissago Council, that it was not until the end of the first year of their administration, and then only with extreme reluctance, that they would take up the manifest need for a lingua franca for the world. They seem to have given little attention to the various theoretical universal languages which were proposed to them. They wished to give as little trouble to hasty and simple people as possible, and the world-wide distribution of English gave them a bias for it from the beginning. The extreme simplicity of its grammar was also in its favor. It was not without some sacrifices that the English-speaking peoples were permitted the satisfaction of hearing their speech used universally. The language was shorn of a number of grammatical peculiarities. The distinctive forms for the subjunctive mood, for example, and most of its irregular plurals were abolished. Its spelling was systematized and adapted to the vowel sounds in use upon the continent of Europe, and a process of incorporating foreign nouns and verbs commenced that speedily reached enormous proportions. Within 10 years from the establishment of the World Republic, the New English Dictionary had swelled to include a vocabulary of 250,000 words, and a man of 1900 would have found considerable difficulty in reading an ordinary newspaper. On the other hand, the men of the new time could still appreciate the older English literature. Certain minor acts of uniformity accompanied this larger one. The idea of a common understanding and a general simplification of intercourse, once it was accepted, led very naturally to the universal establishment of the metric system of weights and measures, and to the disappearance of the various makeshift calendars that had hitherto confused chronology. The year was divided into 13 months of 4 weeks each, and New Year's Day and Leap Year's Day were made holidays, and did not count at all in the ordinary week. So the weeks and months were brought into correspondence, and moreover, as the king put it to Firmin, it was decided to nail down Easter. In these matters, as in so many matters, the new civilization came as a simplification of ancient complications. The history of the calendar throughout the world is a history of inadequate adjustments, of attempts to fix seed time and midwinter that go back into the very beginning of human society, and this final rectification had a symbolic value quite beyond its practical convenience. But the council would have no rash nor harsh innovations, no strange names for the months, and no alteration in the numbering of the years. The world had already been put upon one universal monetary basis. For some months after the accession of the council, the world's affairs had been carried on without any sound currency at all. Over great regions money was still in use, but with the most extravagant variations in price and the most disconcerting fluctuations of public confidence. The ancient rarity of gold upon which the entire system rested was gone. Gold was now a waste product in the release of atomic energy, and it was plain that no metal could be the basis of the monetary system again. Henceforth, all coins must be token coins. Yet the whole world was accustomed to metallic money, and a vast proportion of existing human relationships had grown upon a cash basis. and were almost inconceivable without that convenient liquidating factor. It seemed absolutely necessary to the life of the social organization to have some sort of currency, and the council had therefore to discover some real value upon which to rest it. Various such apparently stable values as land and hours of work were considered. Ultimately the government, which was now in possession of most of the supplies of energy releasing material, fixed a certain number of units of energy as the value of a gold sovereign, declared a sovereign to be worth exactly 20 marks, 25 francs, $5, and so forth, with the other current units of the world, and undertook, under various qualifications and conditions, to deliver energy upon demand as payment for every sovereign presented. On the whole, this worked satisfactorily. They saved the face of the pound sterling. Coin was rehabilitated, and after a phase of price fluctuations, began to settle down to definite equivalents and uses again, with names and everyday values familiar to the common run of people. Section 8. As the Brissago Council came to realize that what it had supposed to be temporary camps of refugees were rapidly developing into great towns of a new type, and that it was remolding the world in spite of itself, it decided to place this work of redistributing the non-agricultural population in the hands of a compacter and better qualified special committee. That committee is now, far more than the council of any other of its delegated committees, the active government of the world. Developed from an almost invisible germ of town planning that came obscurely into existence in Europe or America, the question is still in dispute, somewhere in the closing decades of the 19th century, its work, the continual active planning and replanning of the world as a place of human habitation, is now, so to speak, the collaborative material activity of the race. The spontaneous, disorderly spreadings and recessions of populations, as aimless and mechanical as the trickling of split water, which was the substance of history for endless years, giving rise to congestions, here to chronic devastating wars, and everywhere to a discomfort and disorderliness that was at its best only picturesque, is at an end. Men spread now, with the whole power of the race to aid them, into every available region of the earth. Their cities are no longer tethered to running water and the proximity of cultivation. Their plans are no longer affected by strategic considerations or thoughts of social insecurity. The aeroplane and the nearly costless mobile car have abolished trade routes. A common language and a universal law have abolished 1,000 restraining inconveniences, and so an astonishing dispersal of habitations has begun. One may live anywhere, and so it is that our cities are now true social gatherings, each with a character of its own, and distinctive interests of its own, and most of them with a common occupation. They lie out in the former deserts, these long wasted sun baths of the race. They tower amidst eternal snows, they hide in remote islands, and bask on broad lagoons. For a time the whole tendency of mankind was to desert the river valleys in which the race had been cradled for 500,000 years, but now that the war against flies had been waged so successfully that this pestilential branch of life is nearly extinct, they are returning thither with a renewed appetite for gardens laced by watercourses, for pleasant living amidst islands and houseboats and bridges, and for nocturnal lanterns reflected by the sea. Man who is ceasing to be an agricultural animal becomes more and more a builder, a traveler, and a maker. How much he ceases to be a cultivator of the soil, the returns of the redistribution committee showed. Every year the work of our scientific laboratories increases the productivity and simplifies the labor of those who work upon the soil. and the food now of the whole world is produced by less than 1% of its population, a percentage which still tends to decrease. Far few people are needed upon the land than training and proclivity dispose towards it, and as a consequence of this excess of human attention, the garden side of life, the creation of groves and lawns and vast regions of beautiful flowers, has expanded enormously and continues to expand, for, as agricultural method intensifies and the quota is raised, one farm association after another, availing itself of the 1975 regulations, elects to produce a public garden and a pleasaunce in the place of its former fields, and the area of freedom and beauty is increased, and the chemist's triumphs of synthesis, which could now give us an entirely artificial food, remain largely in abeyance, because it is so much more pleasant and interesting to eat natural produce and to grow such things upon the soil. Each year adds to the variety of our fruits, and the delightfulness of our flowers.